afterwards.
Super.
And I'm hitting live. All right, and we are live now.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Grove. I'm the Commissioner at DEED, and welcome to our webinar on the latest news as it relates to safely returning to work. We are live now, but of course we'll be posting this archived video as soon as it's produced on our website as well. And I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleagues in state government, Commissioner Nancy Lepping from the Department of Labor and Industry, Commissioner Sarah Strawman from the Department of Natural Resources, Deputy Commissioner Dan Huff from the Department of Health, and our Chief of Staff, Anna Peterson from DEED, who's going to walk us through how this will work, and then we'll get right into the content. And really the purpose of this whole conversation is for us to give some more details on the announcements the governor made yesterday relating to businesses that can open on June 1, and then mainly to take your questions. So Anna, why don't you walk us through how this will work, and then we'll dive in.
Sounds great. Thanks, Commissioner. Hey, everybody. So this is a Microsoft Teams meeting, and during the webinar, participants can listen, but you can also start to ask questions in the Q&A function on Teams. And on the screen, you'll see how you can hover over your screen, and there's a Q&A is open. You can click there and type your questions. Please also read the questions that other people have already submitted, and then you can use a little thumbs up to like those questions. As we get to the Q&A section, I will start reading in the order of popularity. So I'll start reading those questions that everybody liked the most, so that we can get through the most popular questions, and we'll read as many as we can during the Q&A. So that's how it will work. And with that, I think we can dive in. Commissioner Grove.
Great, thanks, Anna. Well, as you saw in the governor's press conference yesterday, or in the coverage since then, obviously we took another step yesterday in providing some guidance on the road ahead for safely reopening businesses and getting our economy moving as much as possible during a really unprecedented public health crisis. And, you know, we walked through in detail from the Department of Health some of the latest public health figures and statistics here, but I think it's just important at a high level to remember that we are still on the upswing of this disease in Minnesota. We are nowhere near the peak yet, and cases and death counts rise by the day. And so we're in a situation in which, you know, our peak is not yet reached, yet we want to be able to do everything we can to get our economy moving in a safe and responsible way. And that is the balance that the governor is trying to strike in all these decisions. And so what you saw yesterday was the forecasting of some changes that will come forth on June 1st with a lot of detail around them. And then also a phased plan of what the next couple of steps would look like too. And this is really built on the guidance that we've heard from businesses and workers and so many other stakeholders, that the more predictability you can build into the system, the more advanced planning that you can give to businesses to know what will happen and how to prepare for that, the better off we'll all be. Providing a very detailed timeline for that is not as advisable, given that we can't predict exactly what the virus will do, but knowing kind of what would come next in a logical order of what's safer and not is the goal of this announcement. And so probably one of the most important things to take a look at is this grid that we released yesterday. And this is just the top 3 categories of it. This is a screenshot, not an exhaustive look at the grid. So we recommend you go to that URL. It's a little lengthy, but I'll tell you that the way to get to that grid is to go to mn.gov/COVID-19. And if you go to the Stay Safe MN page of that site, you'll see the grid. And so I'd actually encourage everybody to take a look at that now. In fact, I'm going to pull it up myself here just so I can look at it just as you'd be looking at it. And I want to walk you through kind of the high level of what the governor announced yesterday, and then I'll get into some of the details on restaurants, and then I think Sarah will get into some of the details on personal care, or sorry, on campgrounds, and then Nancy will get into some of the details on personal care services. So, you know, I think that the overarching thought here is that on June 1st, a couple of things are going to be changing. One of them is that restaurants are not going to be open for outdoor seating. The other is that personal care services are going to be open indoors, a limited capacity, and lots of requirements around what needs to take place in those settings. And then the last is that campgrounds will be opening, developed campgrounds will be opening, but with some real restrictions on the use of common areas, and Commissioner Stroman will get to that in a little bit. The rest, though, remains the same. Gatherings need to remain at 10 or less. Teleworking has to take place wherever it is possible. And then the same business openings that have been in effect up till now stay the same. And so you've seen that with sort of retail at 50% capacity, and sports and recreation remaining the same guidance that we've had as well. So those things stay consistent. The next phase then gets into further openings of things that exist in society today. And I think the key things that will happen in that next phase are the gatherings would move up to 20 or less rather than just 10 or less. That restaurants would then go to an indoor setting as well, with some guidelines there. And I think, the important guidelines really around these settings where there's close proximity is the use of masks and social distancing. And so you're going to begin to see masks being not just sort of optional, but required, because making them required makes that guidance really clear, and it protects both workers and customers in settings where there's just a much higher rate of transmission. And Commissioner Lepping can speak to this as our enforcement agency on safety, but this is something that we have just got to get right from a business perspective. From where we sit, if we open up and don't get safety requirements right, and we see hotspots develop, it's going to erode the trust that the public has in the confidence to go out and engage in commerce. So some of these guidelines, while they seem kind of like head scratchy and a little odd socially, are actually essential to make sure that we can get the business aspects of this right. And I think Commissioner Lepping can speak to that in more detail and expertise than I, but I did want to mention that here as we start talking about some of these requirements. Personal services then in that next phase would tick a little further as well. Capacity limits would go from 25 to 50. In that next phase as well, outdoor settings would begin to open in terms of movies and parks and concerts and things. We have some capacity limits there. Places of worship would go in that next phase as well, for outdoors and indoor services, with some maximum requirements there too. And then pools would open at a capacity of 50% too. And then the other phase that we have included in all of this is it would be the next step in this journey, and that would begin to open up gyms and personal fitness centers, bowling alleys and places of public amusement, areas where there's, again, less predictability in the setting, which makes it riskier. A lot of contact and longer periods of contact, and so given that risk profile, they're a little further out in the phases here, and of course, guidelines will accompany some of those releases as well. So the grid you see before you goes into all that in detail. I think rather than speak to every single detail of every single setting, we'll leave that open to the Q&A and just focus in particular on the three bigger changes coming up on June 1st. So I'll dive into restaurants first, and then I'll, as I said, turn it over to Commissioner Lepping and Commissioner Stroman to talk about personal care services and campgrounds. So for restaurants and bars, the big shift is allowing for outdoor dining in addition to curbside delivery and pickup. And as Deputy Commissioner Huff will tell you, and his colleagues at Health will tell you, outdoor environments are much safer than indoor environments as it relates to the spread of the virus. That's been shown across the world. And so outdoor dining is kind of the first step that you can take in terms of allowing dining at a restaurant that is the safest among the steps. In that outdoor dining environment, tables have to be 6 feet apart, no more than 50 people total in any given dining environment. The number of people at a table is limited to 6 if you're at a family, 4 if you're not part of a family unit. Reservations only, so no walk-ins. Again, trying to create the most predictable environment possible. And then workers will have to wear masks, and customers will be strongly encouraged to. And we really ask customers to take that to heart. Wearing a mask as a customer, obviously you can't wear a mask and eat and drink. That's not practical, but you can certainly wear a mask when you're ordering, when you're walking in and out of the restaurant, when you're going to the bathroom, these other in-between moments. And I know it seems awkward, but it's so important to protect those workers who are coming back to serve those who are able to come into restaurants, to keep them safe. And so masks just become an increasingly important part of this. And it's one of these things that, as a society, we just kind of have to get used to. It's a weird norm, but it's one that we have to model for each other and make it as as least awkward as we possibly can, because it's so important for safety. So that's the gist on restaurants. I think for all of these things, a preparedness plan is required. So we want every business who is moving into this new zone to have a plan, to post it, to share it, so that there's safety plans there. I'll leave it to Commissioner Lepping to go into details on those, but every business has to have a plan to make sure we get this right. With that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Straumann to talk about camping.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Grove, and hello, everyone. Happy to be here to talk about the reopening of developed campgrounds. And I will just also mention that this also included the reopening of charter boat operations. I'm really going to focus on the campground piece. I know that that's a important element of a Minnesota summer for so many folks. So the basic framework here is very similar to what Commissioner Grove described in terms of operators who wish to reopening needing to develop and implement a COVID-19 preparedness plan. And that preparedness plan has a number of different elements that should be addressed in it. And these elements are all described in campground guidance that is posted on the DNR's website, and I'll let you know where to find that in a minute. But the elements that should be addressed really look at how campground operators should adjust their operation during COVID-19, as well as the information that they need to share both with their visitors as well as with their staff. And so the elements include managing the availability of various facilities in the campground, as well as the safe operation of those facilities, managing interactions among visitors and staff, new cleaning protocols, and then that information that is provided to visitors. So making sure that visitors are aware of the kinds of protocols that have been put into place. In particular, operators will need to address capacity limitations given social distancing requirements. So depending on the nature of the particular campground, obviously we have a diversity of operations in Minnesota between our public and private campground operators. It may mean limiting capacity at the campground overall if individual sites are close together and don't have a lot of vegetative screening, or it may, or in addition, may mean limiting or closing specific common facilities or amenities. And so that may be communal fire rings that are available, picnic areas that are available. Obviously, the one that is a significant concern from a health and hygiene perspective would be shared restroom facilities. And so making sure that there are plans in place to address the social distancing in those restroom facilities, as well as the sanitation. And so the guidance walks through the specifics about that. The guidance also talks about making sure that any staff or volunteers that are working on the campground receive training on what is needed to operate safely in terms of social distancing and sanitation guidelines, and also the wearing of masks. Commissioner Grove talked about that, and that's something that the guidance here also addresses, is staff in these operations wearing masks. And then lastly, while we recognize that campgrounds are a place where folks come together and there's a lot of interaction from people, in terms of what needs to happen at a particular individual campsite or campfire ring, those are recommended to be limited to folks only from your immediate household, so that there's that opportunity to limit spread. I think we're looking at some of the more group sites. If you can spread out, then those would offer opportunities for multi-households, but within a single individual campsite household only. The last thing I'll just mention here is that obviously this is an opportunity to open up. No operator is required to open up if they don't feel these conditions work, or if they feel that they want to open up in some kind of phased manner. Obviously that's okay too. So the guidelines try to provide the minimum standards so we have consistency on those social distancing and health issues, but also provide flexibility, recognizing again the diversity of operations of our various campgrounds across the state. And I think with that I will stop and turn it to the next.
Great. Commissioner Lepping, I think, is going to take on personal care services.
So good morning, everyone. So first of all, I want to just express that as Commissioner Grove has said, as we move into these more high risk situations and more complex and more dynamic environments, it's necessary for us to provide more comprehensive guidance for those businesses as they reopen. Also, the guidance is very much informed by the increased knowledge that we now have regarding the spread and the risk of transmission of the COVID virus, and therefore the guidance that's now on DEED's website is also very much informed by that increase in knowledge that we have and what are effective strategies for responding to that risk. So with regard to guidance for personal care services, I think as anyone can understand, this is one of those very high risk situations because of the significant difficulty of maintaining consistently 6 feet of social distancing. So as a consequence, there are a variety of things that were addressed for this industry to begin to reopen. And one of the things was that, of course, the baseline is any time you're thinking about numbers of people, numbers of clients, numbers of workers in your workplace, it has to be that those numbers are dictated by how you can ensure 6 feet of social distancing. So that means that even though we have indicated that a capacity could be up to 25%, if your facility does not allow for 6 feet of social distancing of workers and customers within your environment, then obviously that capacity would need to be lowered. But so the rule is the capacity is that what can be achieved with 6 feet of social distancing. Also, of course, to create some more predictability, the guidelines provide for that clients are by appointment only, that there's no provision for walk-in. This, of course, then allows for the business and for the customer to be in the facility only as long as they need to be able to accommodate that 6 feet of social distancing that's required more effectively. And so consequently, similar to restaurants, which is by reservation only, the same is true for personal care services by appointment only. And then, of course, the main issue here is because of the difficulty of providing personal care services and obviously maintaining that 6 feet of social distancing. So this is where then the need for much more strict requirements related to wearing of masks. So in this instance, both workers and the customers will need to wear masks at all times. And in those instances where a worker is and performance of the personal service requires longer duration of that engagement and or really face-to-face engagement, then the need to wear a face shield in addition to the mask. And also the guidance also makes clear in this instance that if you can't perform the service under those conditions, then the service should not be performed. So, and we're quite confident that there are many services that can be performed by meeting these requirements, but there are certainly some that it is difficult to imagine how they would be performed if in particular to perform it, the client is not in a position to wear a mask. So as I said, these more in-depth guidance requirements are in part because of the increased risk of transmission, the more complex work environment and customer interaction, the significantly increase of duration of that engagement, and of course, the increased knowledge that we have regarding transmission and the precautions that can be put in place to reduce that transmission. Also, I think it needs to be made clear that these are safety precautions, but in no instance are we, the safest option you have is to stay at home. And once you are moving out and about in public, then you are adding to your risk that you may contract the disease. So that's why I sort of want to reiterate what Commissioner Grove said about wearing masks. I mean, this is not only a kindness, it provides some protection for you, but really what it is it's providing protection to other people. If you, by chance, are one of those lucky folks who contract the disease but don't have any symptoms or have very mild symptoms, so that doesn't necessarily stop you from continuing to engage. Please think seriously about always wearing a mask, particularly obviously in circumstances where you are in proximity with other people. So now for the preparedness plan. So first of all, I want to make clear that, because I think there may have been some confusion, that the requirement that you have a COVID preparedness plan, I mean, the idea is that really that what we meant here is that you literally had to have a written plan. For those companies who are in critical businesses, this doesn't mean that you don't need to have developed a plan and that you don't need to be following CDC guidelines and MDH guidelines. In fact, you absolutely do need to have a plan, though it may not need to be in writing. And you do need to ensure that your business is complying with CDC and MDH guidelines and OSHA standards that would be relevant to COVID-19. And so we're feeling that some businesses have sort of had the idea that because they're critical, they did not need to be thinking about COVID-19 and sort of have had a wait and see attitude as to whether it presents a problem in their business. And that is not the way to go about this. And I think we have enough examples of businesses now in the state that didn't do what they needed to do, and now they are in difficulty with hotspots in their businesses and in their industries. So first of all, as this slide says, businesses are encouraged, but as indicated, they're not required to use the template that's been provided by the state. It also must be updated to meet your business needs. So those restaurants who were considered critical for then providing takeout, at this point, if you expand your service, you're going to need to have a plan consistent and have a written plan that is addresses all of the elements of the guidelines that now have been posted on DEED's website. Strongly encourage any business to, if you have questions about what you need to do to develop your plan. First of all, there's many organizations now that are providing assistance to businesses in addressing that, including, for example, the American Institute of Architects and various other, the Industrial Hygiene Association. There are various organizations that have much assistance on their websites for businesses, in addition to the Restaurant Association and Hospitality Association. So these are good sources of information. However, the department also has a consultation service. We have staffed up our phones to respond to employers' questions, and also we still have some availability to literally do on-site consultations to work with the business in helping them address their needs to prepare a COVID-19 preparedness plan. So with that, I turn it over to the next.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. And just wanted to do a couple of quick highlights of content available before we take your questions. And we have revamped the website at mn.gov/deed/safe work to include all the guidance documents that Nancy just spoke to. mn.gov/deed/guidance is where you can go directly to those documents. And as you can see here, we have very detailed playbooks written out for restaurants and bars, personal care services, retail, outdoor recreation, sort of general guidance as well. Each of those comes with a lot of guidance that we have gotten in lengthy consultation and thoughtful consultation with industry leaders, both in business and in labor, to make sure that we're thinking through all of the unique dynamics that are specific to various industries as it relates to health and safety. So please do take a look at those guidance documents, and again, they will help in the creation of your safety plans that are meant to be, really plain spoken, easy to understand, guidance for workers on how to make sure CDC guidelines are met and that the state guidelines that we've implemented here are met as well. If you go to the next slide, I think we have a preview of guidance documents to come. Obviously, these settings are not open in the same way, but I want folks to know that the team is working very hard on putting together guidance documents for these settings too, so that people can begin to plan for what these future phases will look like. So please keep an eye on that website for more information. And obviously the other URL for all things COVID related is mn.gov/COVID-19. With that, I think we'll move to questions. Is that right, Anna? Great. So
That's right.
Anna Peterson will be our moderator for this. And again, submit those questions on the little question icon and vote on the ones you like the most. And Anna will be monitoring that and service them up. And we're excited to engage. Hey, Anna.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we have received almost 70 questions. So thank you for voting on the ones you like best. Like I said, I'm going to start with the ones with the most votes. Here's the first question. Will there be any ability for businesses to petition for an individualized or an individual exception if they can prove that they have plans in place that create predictability, allow social distancing, and will be adequately protected against the spread of COVID-19?
That's a great question, and I can totally understand the desire to say, hey, look, like we've been thinking this through, we're prepared, we have plans, we can get this right, and we hear that from so many businesses, and we do understand it. But we are not in a position where we can just make one-off determinations for businesses that may have gotten a plan right or may not have. We do need broad standards that apply to entire sections of the economy, both to make sure we can enforce and implement these guidelines correctly, but also for the kind of basic questions around fairness. There are tens of thousands of businesses in the state, and your state government has neither the desire nor the capacity to vet every single plan that every single business has in place. And if we were to say, hey, you could apply to be safe, show us how safe you can be, it'd take us months to go through the applications we get, because of course everybody would want to be back in business. So I understand the very real desire to say, hey, look, like we can get this right and we have a plan. And I bet that you do, and that you could. But we're looking at the whole picture here as to what we need to do to make sure that we slow the spread of this disease. And that's why the guidance needs to be broad, and why we're not evaluating them business by business, but putting those guidance documents in place by industry at the time that makes sense, given, again, that we are on the increase of this public health crisis. So it's a great question. I understand the desire behind it, but we are not able to create individual exceptions at this time.
Great. Next question. I think this pertains to restaurants. Can customers using the outdoor space go inside to use the restrooms?
Commissioner Lupton, you want to take that one? I think you're on.
Yes, they may. The request would be, though, that and we fully understand that customers may need to transverse interior space to get to outdoor seating, but the request there is that the customer will wear a mask when they are going to the restroom, when they are transversing, so going maybe from a wait station into a patio, the check-in station to the patio area. The request there is that the customer will wear a mask when they're engaged in those activities, so that to protect both their fellow customers, but also to protect the workers.
Great, thank you. Next question. Can you provide clarity on youth sports? We were told that the prior executive order was only relevant to retail, while latest guidance suggests that groups of 10 or less with social distancing is allowed. However, the DNR guidance says that organized activities in sports are prohibited, contradicting the info. Can you provide clarity?
Sure. I don't know, Commissioner Strongman, if you want to take this one or not. The guidance on social distancing in youth and student programs was updated on, I think, the 13th of May, and I believe it's available on DNR's website, if I recall. Do you want to speak to some of the pieces there?
Yes, and I will say that actually the youth and adult organized athletics has not been part of the DNR's effort on this. And so what our guidance speaks to is under the current executive order, those activities are not permitted. I mean, obviously there's the groups of 10, but it's the organized youth and adult athletics are not permitted. And so that future guidance is being addressed in a separate process. And I believe, actually, I'm not sure. I believe it will be put maybe on Department of Health's website and then linked from both education and DNR. But that's still being worked on since that isn't currently in effect here.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think we expect more guidance on youth sports to be coming out, I think even today or tomorrow. So we'll send around a link once it is. I think the big picture though is that we're still at this space where gatherings of 10 or less are important. And the kinds of sporting activity that takes place has to be of a nature that you can do so socially distanced in a socially distant manner. So what's that? Did I cut out?
Yeah, you cut out.
Oh, shoot.
You're back.
Okay. Well, just briefly, I think because youth sports is so critical and parents are thinking, geez, here comes summer, I need something to have my kids do, and it's all part of it's a childcare piece here too, right? So just say quickly that 10 or under still remains the guideline of, I think, the size of activities. I think individualized activities, sports you can play 6 feet apart are still the guidance on that front. I think the thing that's changing now is that's been kind of a broad guidance as it relates to any sport that could take place. And what is going to happen next as summer comes is associations and clubs and groups, the ones who organize those activities, will be able to come back and be in business and think through new ways to get youth sports right, given some of those guidelines. So more to come, because I know this is an important one and there's some guidance that's still being developed in preparation for June 1. So more soon.
All right, next question. As the owner of a grocery, retail, yoga studio, I received a PPP loan that would require me to hire my staff back by the end of June. If we aren't allowed to open by that time, how will the loan be forgiven? Also, having a retail grocery juice bar inside a yoga studio, I'm considered an essential business for the grocery and also for the retail at 50% capacity. But how can the world's largest candy store open with an apple orchard, which allows them to open their entire rest of their business, but not mine? I have UV filtration system, air exchange, 150-degree heat and humidity in my yoga studio.
It's quite the entrepreneur there with several businesses going at once. It's amazing. And these kinds of cases are sort of complex, right? Because you got to kind of consider where each setting is happening in its own right, adjacent to the other settings. A couple of questions were in there. I guess I can speak to the broad guidance first, which is just that understood that there are businesses that are set up really well for indoor activity, but the overall guidance on gyms and yoga studios and the like is that those kinds of activities involve a lot of heavy breathing and sweat and things that cause transmission of the disease to be a much higher risk, and that's why those come in later phases. I think the desire to do outdoor yoga classes and parks and things is definitely something that is being considered and discussed, and there's pieces of that do fit under the guidance for gathering types, but as businesses, we aren't at a place where gyms and yoga studios can reopen under the phase that we are in. So I'd ask that question asker to just think of the yoga studio as, even if it's on the same premises, obviously I'm sure the studio is outside of the retail space, and to consider those spaces separate. I think we have Deputy Commissioner Kevin McKinnon on the line from DEED, who may be able to speak to the PPP question. I know this is something that many businesses have been asking about, given the temporal length of those loans being just 8 weeks. And are we able to get Kevin's voice piped into this? I can take a shot at it, but Kevin's the expert here.
I don't see Kevin on as a presenter right now.
Okay, I saw his name below here, so.
Oh.
Kevin, can you hear me?
Oh, you're right. I do see Kevin. Sorry. Hi, Kevin.
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So my understanding as it relates to the PPP loans are the forgiveness is based on 75% of the loan being provided to payroll and those types of expenses. in order to be forgiven by June 30th. And if employees are on the payroll through that time, the loan is eligible for forgiveness. If they're not, then I believe it is a loan.
Great. This question comes from Nicholas of the City of Fairfax. The recommendation for local bars and restaurants to work with cities is certainly a good one. We were in the process of opening up public green space for use for outdoor seatings prior to the June 1 announcement, but held off until we received the latest update yesterday. One of the major items we need clarification on is the state's stance on consumption of alcohol on sale in an outdoor setting where the venue is a public sidewalk, street, or green space adjacent to or within close walking distance of the bar and restaurant.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll tell you, I was just on the phone with our general counsel before this call for some clarity on this issue, because I think the one question is just, is this a city issue or is it a state issue? And our read of the consumption issue here is that it's a city issue, and there's a statute on this. It's 340A.410 subdivision 7, and it requires that establishments have alcoholic and beverage licenses that are that relate to the kind of contiguous space that they operate. And so I think that the question boils down to the fact that the city would have to approve any additions to the contiguous space that you have that would classify for the license for that premises, right? So if your license is currently for indoors, the city would have to allow you to expand that license to an outdoor space. And there may be some cases in which, in order to do that, getting a catering license will help you navigate getting further extensions of your licensing ability to sell alcohol. So it is a city issue to our read, and we're asking cities to get creative and thoughtful with business owners there to make sure that they can allow for that kind of consumption, because clearly there's going to be businesses who are opening up space that was never considered to be outdoor and not part of an outdoor strategy now that we're allowing only outdoors. And so we're urging business owners and restaurant owners to work with city governments on this and look at those two avenues for licensing, for expanding the space that your license covers and looking at a catering license if that's the better way to navigate it as well.
Great. Here's the next question. Sometimes they jump around. Are brewery tap rooms allowed to open with their outdoor spaces as of June 1st with the same guidelines as bars and restaurants?
Commissioner Lappin, you want to take that one?
Sure. It's my understanding that would be they would need to follow the same guidelines, and that they would be open if they can follow the guidelines.
Everything from cost estimates to...
Great, thank you. Regarding the new mask requirements, are plastic face shields allowable instead of cloth masks? Many restaurants and salons are asking about this.
So the answer to that question, this is Nancy Leppin again, is that the cloth source control masks needs to be worn at all times. But there are certain circumstances where, in addition to the cloth mask, the face shield would need to be added, because the idea here is that the face shield is not a source control. The face shield is like a barrier, and so therefore you need the source control for protection of the customer, but you need the face shield for the protection, the further and more the protection of the worker, and in the form of a barrier. So kind of thinking about it in that way. So that's why. So it gets very tricky when we're talking about protective gear to understand if you're wearing it to protect yourself or if you're wearing it to protect other people. So the face mask is to protect other people. The shield would be to protect the wearer. And again, as I described it, it's a barrier, similar to if you put up a plastic barrier between you and a customer to do someone's nails, and you just like slide your hands underneath the plastic barrier. That's a barrier. But where that kind of mechanism of a barrier can't be used, then the face shield is then a barrier to meet the same, or to perform the same function.
Thank you. Tennessee has more active and total cases than Minnesota, yet they are reopening restaurants, bars, and retail stores at 75% capacity and gyms at 50% capacity this coming Monday. Why isn't Minnesota following the acts of states that are more aligned to our current COVID-19 landscape versus aligning ourselves with the orders of New York and New Jersey, which are statistical anomalies in the US?
I think it might be interesting to hear from Deputy Commissioner Dan Huff on this one, just from a health perspective. Dan, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. So it's a good question. Why are states doing it differently? We don't have necessarily a national strategy on this, but what we do is we rely upon CDC guidance, and we're closely looking at our measures. We have those measures on our dashboard. We have a few measures that we're quite concerned about. One is our hospitalization rate for COVID-19 is continuing to increase. Our mitigation strategies are to make sure that we don't hit like what New York City hit, or New York. The way disease is spread is, and what we've seen in COVID, it spreads until it doesn't have people to infect anymore, or we're going to get herd immunity that will stop it from spreading so quickly. If we do not continue with effective mitigation strategies, then we will see acceleration in growth, and then we hit an exponential peak, and it's really hard to stop at that point. One of the challenges for us is it takes about 5 days after one's infected to have symptoms. Not everyone is symptomatic. Then it usually takes another few days before days to weeks before those symptoms become severe enough that someone would seek health care, especially hospitalization. So any mitigation strategy that we put in place today, we would not see the impact on the disease spread for another 2 to 4 weeks. So I think you're heading towards a tree. It's about when you slam on the brakes, depends on how fast you're going. We have a 2 to 4 week lag time in our brakes. If we let off the brakes too fast and we going too fast, we're going to be crashing healthcare before we know it. We know how absolutely devastating this is for businesses, for our economy. However, the goal is, how do we open safely without crashing our healthcare system and ending up like New York City? And if we don't do it safely, we will.
Thank you, Dan. And I think we're out of time for questions. Commissioner Grove, you want to wrap?
Great. Well, thank you for that, Dan. And thank you to my colleagues, Commissioner Nancy Lepping, Commissioner Sarah Stroman, and Deputy Commissioner Kevin McKinnon for being here, as well as Anna Peterson, our Chief of Staff at DEED. And thank you most of all to you, the folks who've tuned into this, and the questions that you've asked. It's been really helpful. I think these questions also get us smarter on where to go from here and how to make sure that our guidance is clear and thoughtful and well understood, and that it's in the right place. And so I want to thank everyone for your questions. We're going to do more of these types of engagements and questions and answers in the coming days and weeks to make sure everyone understands the guidance as it is laid out, so that when June 1 hits, those businesses that are reopening are all doing so in a way that's safe, and that we begin to increase the amount of commerce we can have happen in our state at a time when doing so safely is the top priority. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.